Hi guys, and welcome back to another video. So today we are going to be drawing another Honkai Star Rail character now that I finished the one of March, and I'm gonna move on from Dan Heng for a little bit, so we might return back to him at some other point. But today I kind of wanted to attempt to draw Blade. He's kind of a character that I guess at this point would have been released at this point, and his character is a little bit hard for me to draw just because I tend to not draw characters that seem a little bit more, well, one, he's kind of evil, and the other thing, he's kind of like feels more dark and brooding, or kind of just, bad intentions kind of thing, kind of a different demeanor to what I usually like to draw. So we're gonna start off with some sketching. I did do some thumbnailing in my sketchbook, and I did a heck of a lot of thumbnailing. Not very good thumbnailing, but just enough for me to kind of like rule out some ideas for poses for Blade. I'm gonna struggle through a lot of different poses for Blade because the one that I initially wanted to do just didn't really work out, which is kind of like the first one I'm gonna do right now, and it's actually very similar to what the actual drawing's going to end up looking like. But we're gonna go through just a few other poses before we get there. So here's sketch number 2, and like my other drawings that I've done kind of like more recently anyways, I like to sketch with a kind of larger brush so that I'm not too focused on doing details or wanting to zoom in to make things like too complicated. I'm literally here just to make sure that I can kind of flesh out the body to a certain extent so that I can kind of plan out the composition or know where the body and stuff is before I actually start to do my more clean sketch. So this is the second sketch, and at some point, as soon as I start putting like the indication of like spider lilies, which I want to be included into the composition, I thought I was at a point like, oh, maybe I actually like the composition and the pose enough so I can move on, but I scrapped that one too, and I was thinking maybe I won't include Blade's sword into the composition so I could have him more almost like not scheming, maybe, well, I guess it's like maybe a cross between scheming and brooding, where he could be more like hunched over a little bit, kind of lurching forward with his hands near his face, kind of like hiding a smirk or something. I thought I could do something like that, and once again I put in the flowers because I was like, maybe I like the idea, maybe I don't. But like, I kind of want to break out from not doing too many like face on poses, so I decided to reattempt the first pose again. And like I said, this is the one that I had technically planned from the very beginning. I did kind of a little bit of a larger thumbnail in my sketchbook on a few post-it notes, and I kind of wanted to do it because it makes the most sense in my brain. But we're gonna go through a whole process with this illustration because there's just things I like and dislike about it, and I feel like there's some things that I could have better executed, if anything. So let's move on to the next part of the sketch though. So if you're struggling with poses like I am, let me introduce you to justsketch.me. Justsketch.me is a pose reference tool that helps you spend less time on the planning and more on the most important part, which is making great art. This tool allows you to manipulate the poses of human models, but there are also a variety of different models to choose from. The color dots are the joint points that you can rotate and manipulate to your heart's desire. You can change the lighting with the little floating yellow dot as well. It's a great way to plan out different scenes. Maybe you need to pose multiple characters, or you're looking for a specific angle of a pose. It's a good way for you to learn different angles of the body or different angles of poses. I know I like using this to help me with foreshortening the most. I really like the fact that the points at each joint are also very easy to manipulate, but also allow you to make an endless amount of combinations to express your character. I wanted to pose the model for potential poses for future Blade drawings, so I struggled a lot with posing him, but this allows me to pose and save as many references of the models at different angles, and this way I can have so many references at my disposal. You can place objects for props or even stuff for the environment. I'll show you my quick sketches using the models as my starting point for each of them. Even though my sketches may not be the most accurate here, using the model kind of helps me break out of some of my sketching habits of repetitive poses. This would have helped me plan out Blade's pose instead of struggling to pose him 4 times before settling on a pose finally. I think this is a wonderful tool for people who are looking to speed up their planning process for their artwork. JustSketch.me is available for free with no time limit. The first 100 people to use the code RinSpiritArt to sign up to Just Sketch Me Pro will get 20% off. Do check them out and start creating. So let's get back to sketching out Blade. Okay, so now moving on to the next part of the sketch. This is basically more or less my cleaner sketch, which I'm going to be using as the base for coloring before we get to the rendering and cleanup. But I think most of you guys are probably familiar with my process, so there's not too much to talk about. I am using the kind of larger shapes and the rough guidelines to basically help me keep things a little bit more in place and making sure that things look a little bit more proportionate. Usually at this part, I also tend to make the face a little bit too large, so at some point I am going to resize and make sure that things look kind of somewhat correct before we can move on to the rest of the body for Blade. Another thing is that I think similar to my Kaya piece, pose wise, as well as just like his face, there is part of his face where it's kind of covered. For Kaya's part, it's more like an eye patch covering his eye, but for Blade, he does have his bangs basically covering the one eye, and he only has one eye exposed. So sometimes I feel like I make things a little bit disproportionate because I usually use both eyes to kind of help me center where the face is going to be or where the nose is going to be, but having one part kind of like omitted kind of feels like I feel like I'm squishing the face too thin. So hopefully I'm not doing that. And I think the end result for Blade actually turns out pretty okay. I think the overall just illustration for me gets into a weird zone, and I'll talk a bit about that near the end because it's mostly just like the end effects and stuff that I end up putting that kind of makes things feel a little bit too crowded or over the top or just too overly concentrated with too much stuff. It feels a little bit busy, but we'll see when I get there. I think the sketching portion took me at least a little bit longer than I would have liked. I think maybe I didn't have enough planning prior to actually starting this piece, which kind of led me into a weird area where I feel like I wasn't confident working on this piece. And whenever I feel like I'm not too confident or like too excited to work on a piece, I definitely think it kind of transfers into the artwork. It feels a little bit either a little bit more meek, or it just feels a little bit less adventurous sometimes when I even want to try something new. Because like I said, Blade for me is a little bit of a difficult character to draw just because I tend to not draw these kinds of, I don't even know if it's like evil character demeanor. I tend to draw, happier characters, more calm characters, kind of serene-ish kind of feeling, rather than someone that feels a little bit more scheming or a little bit evil, a bit more, I guess, violent, or just like has more aggression, if anything. I feel like I didn't do his expression too much justice, so maybe in the future I'll try again. And I'll do some face studies where we can kind of play around with the face, because when a person gets like upset or I guess like angry, either like in a sad, like either you're sad or you're angry, your face isn't exactly pretty. It tends to be more or less on the contorted side, a little bit ugly. It's not supposed to be super cute or anything. So I definitely feel like I need to do a little bit more studies on just like, how to make the face read a little bit more exaggerated when doing those kinds of expressions, so that you can have that more intense emotion other than like somebody who's either deadpan or even someone who's happier. So just some stuff for me to think about whenever I start a new piece that has a character that's not just generically happy or calm, or just a little bit more of that emotion coming out. I would like to at least get better at that at some point. So for the sketch, I also ended up blocking in where I wanted the flowers to be, because like I said, this is kind of similar to Kaya's illustration a little bit. I wanted to have foreground flowers, some background flowers, and any kind of background elements as well alongside with the character. But for the flowers for Blade's illustration, he is kind of associated with the, I guess they're called spider lilies. I'm not too sure. I remember they have another name, but it's kind of slipping from my brain right now. The petals for the flowers, for me at least, is kind of hard to understand how to draw. I believe they more or less come in like 6 petals and almost in like clusters of 3. So it kind of has a lot of bits going everywhere, and then you have these kind of like spidery thin pieces curving upwards with little almost like bean shaped yellow parts at the end of it. And I've drawn these flowers before, and I've drawn I think them for also a version for Dan Heng, but I've drawn spider lilies for different illustrations in the past. I don't really remember what illustration it was, but I remember just struggling to draw it, so I definitely wanted to block in the shapes and then do the sketch on top. After that, I'm kind of just adjusting my layers right now, so I'm making sure that I duplicated the appropriate layers so that I have a backup. I also changed the color for Blade and the flowers to be on the warmer side, and I'm dropping in the background color. Now I thought this was a good opportunity to show you guys what my sketch looks like on a dark background, and I haven't set my sketch to multiply. So you can see that it's kind of this reddish brown on top of the blue, but once I take my sketch and I change the blend mode of the layer to multiply, it now fits more appropriately with whatever color is underneath. So my lines actually read pretty much black, but once I take off the background, you can see that the color of my sketch is actually more or less kind of like a brown color. So I just thought it'd be, you know, nice to show you guys, because I know some people get confused on what exactly the multiply blend mode layer and how it works pretty much. So you can usually use it on top of colors, or if you have like a sketch that has black and white, you can use it to color underneath your black and white sketch, I guess, because your white will become transparent and your black will become just the lines. So this kind of works out really well when you scan your sketch from, let's say, like a traditional sketch page or anything like that, and you're able to differentiate the white and the black. You can definitely set your sketch to multiply and you'll be able to color underneath it, no problem. Let's actually talk about what I'm doing right now. So besides doing the sketch and everything, I actually laid down kind of the background colors and potentially any kind of scenery for the background. And I had a color palette. Hopefully I'll remember to put it into the video. If I don't, then it's basically kind of dark blue, a bit of orange and red, almost like sunset colors, but the dark bluish purple color is very intense. I also kind of shifted it a little bit more towards that kind of bluish green color, which is a little bit more apparent in Blade's hair because it complements the red really well of the spider lilies. So after I did the background, I went ahead and colored in the flowers because I wanted to do the foreground and the background just quickly before doing Blade, because I wanted to make sure that Blade's colors are gonna be influenced by either the background and the foreground flowers, just because I think it will just fit nicer in terms of the color palette. But for the flowers, so I wasn't going to blur them per se, other than I was going to duplicate them and put some into the backgrounds, make them a lot smaller, and then blur it so that they look like there's a little bit more depth and that they're actually in the background. But the ones in the foreground, you'll probably see a bit later that I end up blurring them because when I was trying to clean up and render them for the foreground, I was doing it on top of the dark background, and I didn't remember that once I put in Blade's colors, a lot of those dark lines that I made for the spider lilies became too apparent, and it became too, I guess, like cartoony in a sense, and I don't really like that look whenever I do flowers. I want the flowers to look a bit more softer and a little bit less punchy in that sense, so I decided to blur them in the end. So yeah, it's just more like a cop-out if anything, because you can see here sometimes when I outline the flowers or I'm adding kind of deeper shadows or kind of accentuating some of the lines, I'm using kind of almost like a dark purple-ish color, which is coming from the background, and it's gonna be too jarring on top of Blade. It feels kind of sticker-like, so me kind of doing the blurred kind of method on top of the flowers kind of helps knock it back a little bit, and it becomes a lot softer, which is what I initially wanted anyways. So yeah, last but not least, I added the little kind of stray little ends of the spider lilies, and hopefully that kind of reads a little bit nicer. I kind of am also glad that I ended up blurring it, because right now the little ends that curl upwards feel a little bit too jarring in my opinion. I'm not too sure. I also think, like, when I was looking up references for these flowers, there's one that was, I think it's like a screenshot. I don't remember if it's from... Ooh, I don't know if I remember the name of it anymore. One of them is, I think, not Promised Neverland. Or is it? There's another one. I think it's Licorice Recoil. They had spider lilies, and I think it might have been screen capped from that show instead, but they made them look like they're glowing in a sense, so I decided to do that as well for my illustration, just because it feels a little bit more ominous and a little bit more threatening, even though it's kind of like prettier while it's glowing. I just thought it fit a little bit better. But after that, after I finished up the flowers, I made another new layer, put it underneath my sketch, and we can go ahead and color Blade. Now, I'm gonna have a hard time kind of balancing the camera colors a little bit, because the skin tone for Blade is just like, it's on the lighter end, but I did make it a little bit more muted, a little bit darker, because he's in a darker setting, but that makes kind of like the entire palette also a little bit darker, or at least that's what I was trying to do. But because I'm doing like dark on dark, you can't really see it via my camera. It makes it very hard for me to show it on screen, so sometimes his skin's gonna look super blown out and super like looks like it's glowing, because I am upping my gain and my brightness on my camera so that it can pick up the dark parts of his outfit. But then sometimes when I'm working on some other areas, I need to make it darker again so that you guys can see properly, which means that sometimes his clothing might blend into the background once again. Another part that I kind of struggled with also is kind of like Blade's eye. So similar to how I struggle drawing people who have more of a colder demeanor, kind of meaner, evil-ish, kind of, I don't know, sly demeanor, the eyes, because I draw eyes fairly large, or at least in my opinion I do, sometimes I don't want them to be too cutesy. So I also decided that I would not initially draw in a highlight for Blade, so that I can add one right at the bottom potentially, or just not add one at all, because I wasn't sure, like I wasn't too sure if it was gonna match nicely if I ended up putting like a big highlight on the corner or anything like that. I feel like that always gives more of like a doe-like demeanor, or makes people look a little bit younger or a little bit cuter, which is not exactly what I wanted for Blade. If anything, I'm okay making him more like Bishonen maybe, but I don't think I accomplished that either. But it wasn't a too bad of an attempt for the first time drawing of Blade, I guess. So basically for this phase, I'm just kind of blocking in color, and this is what I was talking about, that the color might look super blown out. You can see my iPad's probably looking a little bit lighter too, is because his clothing is quite dark, but it's not going to show up on the dark background, so it's kind of impossible. So even this part, when I was looking at my footage, I was like, it looks like his skin color now. So it's not his skin color. He doesn't have like a weird chest window open for everyone to see or anything like that. It's kind of more of a gold color, but I forgot to turn down the brightness on my camera, so it's gonna be blown out for quite a bit. It is not, yeah, it's not his chest technically, so it is part of his actual outfit, and his outfit looks probably a little bit more blue and a little bit too bright in some areas until I actually knock back my camera lighting. Sorry if I sound a little bit weird. I'm trying to like not yawn. It is like 3:30 a.m. so I'm still doing the voice recording. But yeah, pretty much just filling in all the areas. I'm adding shading where I can. I added pretty much like all the shading and the lighting where I wanted it to be. At the very end of kind of like the rough colors, which is what I consider this process to be, I do end up using an addition layer or an add layer to do the highlights for a little bit of rim lighting on the left side, and then I added a multiply layer to just kind of deepen the shadows on, I think, under his chin next to his right of his shoulder. And then I also end up doing I don't remember if it's like an overlay layer or it's just a kind of quick airbrush of a red, so that I could have it kind of match a little bit closer to the spider lilies in the foreground, because since they are kind of glowing anyways. I don't really exactly remember where exactly I left off, but I'm still blocking in a lot of the rough colors. I am going to adjust some of the colors, the add layer and a multiply layer and an overlay layer, so that we can kind of finish off the coloring before we merge my layers and start to render and to clean up the entire piece. Also, for the patterning on kind of like this chest part, I kind of forgot to add it in during my sketch, and I feel like it's because I wanted to make sure that I could adjust the colors underneath as well. So I set this part onto multiply and kind of used a light grayish purple, drew in kind of like the patterning, and then underneath we can adjust the colors if need be without needing to fuss with the sketch too much. After that, we are moving on to actually coloring in the line work itself. So I have the sketch set to alpha lock, and then we're coloring in the actual lines so that I can make things match a little bit more closely, make things look a little bit softer. But I'm also taking this opportunity to make sure that I'm erasing any like scraggly lines, any stray lines, and all that jazz. But because this drawing is set onto like a dark background, I am also making sure that the outside edges of the lines are also kind of dark enough before I merge my layers, because once I merge them, if there are still a light color, by the time I merge them, the light color will reappear, which also makes things a lot harder for me to clean up at the end, but it makes things look a little bit jarring. Now I'm doing kind of like the additional blend mode layers. So like I said, I did kind of an addition layer. I am doing the multiply layer just for that more intense, deeper shadows. And then after that, I will also add kind of like an overlay of red near the bottom portion where the spider lilies are also present, which kind of tints some of the areas to be a little bit more pink or just a very less pungent red. So hopefully the colors still read at least somewhat correctly in context with the flowers. But after that, I merge everything down onto the color layer, and then we can actually go ahead and start to I was gonna say shade, but we're going to clean up and render things. So that's basically just making things look a little bit more sharper and just kind of getting rid of those scraggly unfinished lines, or kind of making sure that things don't look too uncertain, if that makes sense, which helps contribute to just more of a cleaner look, which is kind of what I'm looking for when I get to this kind of stage. And everything that I did prior up to this stage was kind of to help me prep for a easier time when I start to clean up and render the entire drawing. Usually, I like to start with the face, so I think this time I started with the singular eye. I did a little bit of the hair around his face, and then I went back and did his nose and his mouth and a little bit of his jawline before we can move on. I also deemed this portion kind of more or less the most tedious part, because I find sketching always fun. Color is kind of fun to play around with, so I don't mind doing the rough colors. But this portion, because it's mostly just me color picking, going back and forth between, coloring things in all the way or making sure that I'm racing around the edges to make sure that things looks like kind of like sharper. It's a tedious process that sometimes is fun, because I like seeing the drawing slowly come into focus and kind of, this is where I hit my camera. So when I record these kinds of drawing on my iPad, I have my webcam on a kind of like a desk arm, camera arm type thing, and it's connected to the shelf next to my desk. But the way how I position the camera is like right in front of my iPad, so that I have a pretty much like a direct view. But for me, I have to live with the webcam being in front of my face. So sometimes when I go to reach over across my iPad, or I'm just kind of moving my head, I accidentally hit my head against the camera arm or the actual webcam itself, which causes me to bonk it a little bit, which what you guys probably just saw. I decided to leave it in because I initially forgot to cut it out before doing the voiceover, so I might as well just leave it in at this point. But yeah, that's kind of like the reason why sometimes I prefer drawing with the whatever I'm working on like horizontally facing downwards, so that my webcam can be kind of above it, and then for me I'm kind of viewing it at a skewed angle, but at least I don't have to bonk my head and kind of maneuver my head around my camera. But I still like drawing like this. I think I've gotten used to it so often, or not you. Okay, how am I saying this? My brain's like clearly fried because it's 3:30 in the morning. But I'm used to it basically, so I feel like I haven't bonked my camera in a while, even though it's like in front of my face. So it's not too big of a deal for me, but I just left it in because I was like, wow, it's actually very jarring when I hit my camera and actually, you know, moved a significant amount. But for the rest of the drawing, like I said, it's just mostly cleanup. So you can see like even on the red kind of bandage part, there's kind of like these lighter lines around it. And that's due to me merging my layers. But for my layers, if there's nothing underneath the lines, let's say like a different color or anything like that, then my lines revert back to normal. And you can see that I was kind of using a kind of pale warmish purple color, and the pale warmish purple color will show up because there's no color underneath, therefore the multiply function doesn't work anymore. So it shows up like that, and I have to take some time to kind of clean up those edges so that they no longer show up. But if I made sure to keep the outlines to be dark, or at least similar color to the background, there is going to be a little bit less cleanup because the look of it will be less jarring to the eyes. So yeah, this is more stuff to think about, I guess. His sword also. Like I said, I wanted to include the sword into the composition and just like the overall illustration, just because I thought it would be a little bit more interesting. But I did not draw his sword super correctly, so don't look too closely at it. It's very chunky and rectangular how I drew it, but his sword's a little bit more, I don't know, at least like, I don't know what's the part, like it's the horizontal part above the handle is what I was talking about, but you know, I just drew it however I drew it. Okay, we're actually nearing the end of the illustration, so I popped back in my foreground flowers. I'm also added a little bit of a haze because I wanted to add some kind of smoke, but then after that I was like, maybe I'll add some shapes that look kind of like, I don't know, flames or something kind of flowing, which is why I was saying at the beginning that this might look a little bit too busy. So maybe at the end or at some other point where I feel a little bit more willing to kind of rethink and evaluate this piece, I might just knock back the smoke, or I might knock back kind of like the flame things kind of flowing across. But we're pretty much at the end. I'm slurring my words and I'm feeling tired right now because it's 3:40 now. So hopefully you guys enjoyed today's illustration, and here's the time lapse of Blade from Honkai Star Rail. I think I did an okay job on him. I don't know if it looks too busy at the bottom, so I might get rid of some of the elements, but for the most part it's a good attempt, at least for me. So hopefully you guys enjoyed today's session, and I'll talk to you guys next time in the next video. Bye!